It began with fire, not from artillery, but from gasoline. In December 1944, amid the snow and silence of the Ardennes, a German colonel stared at hundreds of captured barrels of American fuel and realized that victory itself had become a logistical illusion. Colonel Joachim Peiper, commander of the 1st SS Panzer Regiment of the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Division, had just seized over 50,000 gallons of Allied fuel, the one resource his tanks needed most. Yet within hours, that triumph began to unravel into a symbol of Germany's doomed final gamble. The paradox was clear. Even success revealed the scale of failure. For the German High Command, Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes Offensive, was meant to repeat the lightning thrust of 1940. It was Hitler's last hope to split the Allied front, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace before Soviet armies reached Berlin. But beneath the maps and confidence of planning sessions, there lay a crippling truth. Germany no longer possessed the fuel to sustain a prolonged armored campaign. Its synthetic oil plants had been bombed into ruin by Allied air raids. Panzer divisions that once raced across Europe now sat idle, cannibalizing trucks and siphoning every available drop of fuel from training schools, airfields, and depots. Peiper's Kampfgruppe, a powerful spearhead of Tiger II heavy tanks, Panthers, and half-tracks, had been chosen to lead the advance through the Ardennes forest toward the Meuse River. Its reputation was built on speed and shock, but the mathematics of fuel consumption defied strategy. Each Tiger II required nearly 500 liters per 100 kilometers. Even before the first shot, many tanks could not fill their tanks to capacity. The offensive would depend entirely on capturing Allied fuel, a plan as audacious as it was desperate. When Peiper's columns smashed into American positions near Stavelot and Bullingen, chaos followed. U.S. convoys were ambushed on narrow roads. Their jeeps and supply trucks became lifelines for German armor. Near Billingen, Peiper's men overran a fuel depot containing more than 50,000 gallons of gasoline, a jackpot by any measure. Soldiers cheered as they filled drums and jerry cans, finally believing the advance could continue. But the victory was fleeting. The captured fuel, mostly high-octane aviation gasoline, was unsuitable for the carburetors of German tanks without blending or filtration. Mechanics tried to adjust, diluting the fuel with diesel and standard-grade petrol scavenged from wrecks, but engines sputtered and failed. The German dream of momentum began to break down on the icy roads. Every kilometer burned precious reserves. Convoys stretched for miles, trapped in traffic jams behind immobilized armor. American engineers, meanwhile, blew bridges and fuel dumps ahead of the German advance, denying them the very resource they needed most. Peiper's radio operators reported that neighboring SS and Wehrmacht units were also stalled, not by enemy fire, but by empty fuel tanks. The Ardennes forest, once a symbol of stealth and surprise, turned into a graveyard of stalled steel. Peiper's Tiger tanks, their 88mm guns unmatched in firepower, became immobile fortresses. What had been designed as a fast breakthrough became a slow-motion collapse. Peiper pressed on regardless, capturing Stavelot, then La Glaise, but each success deepened his isolation. Allied resistance stiffened. Air cover returned once the fog lifted, and every German movement became visible from above. Fighter bombers shredded convoys, igniting the very fuel they had fought so hard to obtain. In one of his later interrogations, a surviving officer from Peiper's unit recalled that the colonel seemed haunted by the sound of engines dying one by one. The tanks, once symbols of mechanized might, now sat silent in the snow, their crews huddled inside for warmth. Some officers proposed abandoning vehicles altogether. Others suggested turning the fuel over to neighboring units. But Peiper refused to retreat without orders, still clinging to the illusion that headquarters would send reinforcements and more fuel. The truth was darker. There were no reserves left to send. Deutschlands entire Petroleum Output in Dezember 1944 war läst ein Tausendstel, von dem es gewesen war während der Invasion Franz 4 Jahre eher. Die Ironie war brutal. Derselbe industrielle Maschine, das einst mechanische Marvels hervorbrachte, von dem MG-42 Maschinengewehrs 1200 Rounds pro Minute bis zu der Präzisionsengineerung des Panthers 75 mm Gewehr, nun starb für das basische Ingredienzmoser. Logistik, nicht Waffenruhr, hatten bekommen den Truhenbartschaft. Eben die mightigsten Engines waren useless, ohne das Fuhr zu turnen ihre Pistons. Als Peipers Men Siphoned Fuel von Wrecked Trucks mixten Aviationsgasoline mit Motoröl und eben dränten zivilen Cars, begannen sie zu unterstehen, dass diese Offensive war keine Aviva, sondern eine Autopsie. Das Schmell von Captured Fuel, once intoxikierend, nun trug den Sense der Defeat. Und jetzt, Orders demanden, sie pushen vorwärts toward die Möse. The Colonel obeyed. But with every passing hour, his advance grew slower, his options narrower, his realization clearer. Germany's war machine, once unstoppable, was running on fumes. What Peiper didn't yet know was that his Kampfgroup's destruction would come not from lack of courage or skill, but from the very fuel barrels that had promised salvation. In the days to come, the fires of La Glaise would turn those reserves into a funeral pyre for Germany's final offensive. By December 20th, 1944, the Ardennes battlefield had become a labyrinth of frozen mud, twisted metal, and dead engines. Colonel Peiper's column, once the spearhead of Hitler's grand counterattack, was now crawling forward like a wounded animal. The maps in German headquarters still marked his position optimistically. Objective, Meuse. But the reality on the ground was far more desperate. His tanks were trapped between American resistance, dwindling ammunition, and the cold indifference of empty fuel drums. The campaign that was meant to change the war had devolved into a logistical nightmare. Hitler's staff in Berlin had calculated that Peiper's Kampfgruppe could reach the Meuse in 2 days, refueled entirely by captured American supplies. But the plan ignored terrain, weather, and the efficiency of Allied engineers who destroyed every bridge and depot before retreating. Peiper's men had captured more than 100 American trucks intact, a dream for any advancing force. But without gasoline, they were as useless as the abandoned M60 machine gun positions left behind by retreating GIs. Fuel, not manpower or morale, was dictating the pace of war. The deeper Peiper pushed into Belgium, the more he entered a landscape that devoured his advantage. Snowstorms grounded the Luftwaffe, cutting off reconnaissance. Allied air patrols, once the skies cleared, hunted any movement along the roads. Each Panther and Tiger became a beacon for enemy aircraft. German troops learned to scatter whenever they heard the whistle of P-47 Thunderbolts, the same aircraft that, weeks later, would help destroy most of Peiper's column near La Glaise. At Stavelot, the colonel's men seized another small cache of American fuel. Mechanics worked frantically through the night, transferring the liquid lifeblood into any usable container. It was a grim improvisation, not the precision logistics that had characterized earlier German victories. In 1940, the Wehrmacht's motorized divisions had advanced through France with clockwork coordination. In 1944 diese selben Units wurden reduziert zu scavenging like raiders, turning enemy equipment into makeshift survival tools. Als Enemy Armor treibte West, amerikanische Resistenz kristallisierte Kreuzpunktstowns, Malmedy, Staumont, Trois Ponts. Peipers Lead-Elemente repetierte Rannen in Rotblocks, manned bei Ingenieuren und Infanterie, armed mit Bazookas und Anti-Tank-Guns. Each delay trainte mehr Fuel. Every detour meinte einen anderen Tiger left behind. Ein survivender Crewmann rekolte, dass wir hatten zu entscheiden, ob wir den Tank bewegen oder essen. Wir konnten nicht beides. Food Convoys nie richten sie, Supply Lines wurden ambushed oder schlicht aus Fool selbst. Auf dem 22. Dezember reichten Peipers Units La Gleize, ein Small Belgian Village, das wird bekommen der Last Stand. Dort der Colonel setzte auf seinen Kommandopost in einer Farmhaus und orderte Defensivpositionen.
It was a shocking admission for a man trained in offensive doctrine. The Blitzkrieg ideal had always relied on speed, shock, and surprise, on the ability to move faster than the enemy could think. But here, the engines were silent. The famed Kampfgruppe Peiper had become a static fortress of steel, surrounded on all sides. American units, notably elements of the 30th Infantry Division and 3rd Armored Division, closed in from multiple directions. They attacked with a mixture of tanks, artillery, and infantry, overwhelming in number, though often cautious due to the icy terrain. From the air, reconnaissance photographs showed dozens of German vehicles abandoned along the roads, some still intact, others burned out. Many had been destroyed not by American fire, but by their own crews to prevent capture.
The fuel shortage forced Peiper to make brutal decisions. Destroy what couldn't move, retreat with what could. As shells pounded La Gleize, the German colonel knew the offensive was collapsing. Reports from the north indicated that the 6th Panzer Army's advance had stalled. In the south, Patton's 3rd Army was counterattacking with staggering speed. For the first time, German officers in the field began to admit the unthinkable, that the Ardennes Offensive was not a breakthrough, but a trap of their own making. Peiper's radio operators intercepted desperate messages from nearby units begging for fuel, ammunition, even food. No help came. In Berlin, Hitler still demanded perseverance, believing that fog and bad weather would save his armies. But those very conditions now sealed their fate. Allied artillery began to encircle La Gleize. On December 23rd, American forces launched a coordinated assault, supported by fighter bombers that strafed the town relentlessly. Peiper's Tiger tanks, massive and heavily armored, fought back fiercely, knocking out several Shermans. But without fuel, every maneuver was calculated in meters, not miles. The tanks were reduced to fixed gun platforms. The colonel's men began siphoning the last drops of fuel from disabled vehicles, trying to move wounded comrades and ammunition. Others dug in among the ruins. As the night fell, Peiper gathered his remaining officers in the cellar of a farmhouse. Witnesses later recalled the silence more than the words, a silence heavy with the realization that their war was over. Peiper had started the campaign believing he could reach the Meuse in 2 days. 10 days later, he was surrounded, cut off, and running out of everything that kept an army alive. When the final radio message came from higher command, "Hold your position at all costs," it was met with bitter laughter. There was nothing left to hold with. The captured fuel had been consumed, the vehicles burned or abandoned, and the dream of a renewed German offensive buried beneath snow and steel. Peiper decided that his remaining 800 men would attempt a breakout on foot through the forest, leaving behind all equipment, all wounded, and the symbols of a lost cause. They destroyed the rest, tanks, trucks, and even weapons, to prevent them from falling into Allied hands. The burning of La Gleize lit the sky for miles. For many witnesses, it was a grim reflection of the Reich itself, a dying machine consuming its last resources in flames. The fires were fed by the same barrels of gasoline that once promised victory. But Peiper's retreat through the Ardennes was only part of a much larger collapse. Across the Western Front, German forces faced the same fate, not from tactical inferiority, but from starvation of fuel, ammunition, and air support. What Peiper's men had lived through in microcosm, the entire German war effort was now experiencing. The last miracle weapon had failed, and with it, the illusion that technology could replace resources. The next chapter of this story would reveal how Germany's faith in mechanized speed had outstripped its industrial reality, and how one colonel's retreat marked the symbolic end of the Blitzkrieg era. In the frozen aftermath of La Glaise, the myth of German invincibility finally shattered. Peiper's men, once the pride of Hitler's armored elite, trudged through snow and forest under constant artillery and air attack. They abandoned their weapons, their uniforms, even their wounded, anything that slowed them down. Some disguised themselves in civilian coats scavenged from farmhouses. Others carried only their sidearms, reminders of a campaign that had begun as a final offensive and ended as a fight for survival. When American troops entered La Glaise, they found a landscape that resembled an autopsy of Blitzkrieg itself. More than 100 German vehicles lay destroyed or abandoned. Tiger II tanks frozen in place, half-tracks half buried in snow, charred supply trucks still leaking gasoline into the ground. Inside one wrecked Panther, American engineers discovered the remains of a makeshift fuel-mixing rig, a desperate attempt by German mechanics to blend aviation fuel and diesel for engines that would no longer start. The scene told its own story. A modern army defeated not by superior firepower, but by the failure of its own logistics. Intelligence officers quickly realized that the fuel shortage had crippled not only Peiper's unit, but the entire German offensive. Captured documents revealed that by mid-December 1944, Germany's total motor fuel reserves amounted to less than 2 weeks of operations at full intensity. The Allied bombing of Luna and Politz synthetic fuel plants had reduced output to a fraction of pre-war levels. The Luftwaffe was grounded. Training schools for tank crews had ceased operations. Entire panzer divisions were ordered to use bicycles for local patrols, an absurd reflection of the Reich's collapse into improvisation. And yet, the campaign's design still bore the mark of early war arrogance. The planners of Operation Wacht am Rhein had calculated their objectives with the same confidence that once defined 1939 and 1940. They assumed rapid advances, intact road networks, and captured Allied supplies to sustain them. But war had changed. Allied logistics, powered by convoys and the M240 gun trucks that protected them, could move fuel and ammunition with astonishing efficiency. In contrast, Germany's convoys had become vulnerable relics, slow, underarmed, and exposed to air attack. For historians, Peiper's failed offensive symbolized the death of the Blitzkrieg doctrine. That doctrine, born in the interwar years, had been built on the fusion of speed, coordination, and industrial capacity. It required more than daring leadership. It required a system capable of feeding the machines of war. The Wehrmacht's early victories in Poland, France, and the Balkans had masked the fragility of that system. German factories produced some of the most advanced weapons of the era, the MG42 with its blistering rate of fire, the Panther tank with its high-velocity 75mm cannon, but production was fragmented and unsustainable. By 1944, even ammunition shortages were forcing rationing at the front. Peiper himself, captured months later after escaping through the lines, was interrogated about the fuel situation. His response was concise and bitter. The tanks were perfect. The men were willing. The fuel was gone. That single sentence captured the paradox of Germany's final campaign. It had the weapons and experience to fight, but not the infrastructure to keep fighting. The same nation that had pioneered mechanized warfare had outpaced its own ability to sustain it. Inside the ruins of La Glaise, Allied officers conducted detailed technical inspections. They marveled at the craftsmanship of German engines, the precision of their optics, and the efficiency of their fire control systems. But they also noted the chaos of supply. Tanks filled with mismatched fuel types, vehicles carrying ammunition unsuited to their guns, spare parts scavenged from other models. The war machine had eaten itself. In the days that followed, American war correspondents began to describe the Ardennes Offensive as Germany's last gasp. But for soldiers on the ground, it didn't feel like a victory yet.
The snow concealed the scale of the German defeat. Only when the spring thaw revealed thousands of wrecked vehicles, abandoned fuel drums, and hastily buried soldiers did the full magnitude of the collapse become visible. Strategically, the offensive had achieved nothing but delay. It cost Germany more than 600 tanks and assault guns, over 40,000 casualties, and irreplaceable reserves of fuel and ammunition. The Allies lost men and material too, but their supply lines were elastic, constantly replenished by convoys and airlifts. In the end, fuel proved more decisive than any general or weapon. The outcome of the war had been decided not by battles, but by the ability to move, to feed, to power an army. In Berlin, as reports of the failed offensive reached the Führer's headquarters, anger gave way to silence. Hitler's generals argued over who was to blame: poor weather, lack of coordination, Allied air superiority. But in truth, the collapse had been inevitable. The Reich's industrial base was no longer capable of sustaining mechanized warfare. Its railways were bombed, its fuel plants destroyed, its armies starving for energy. The Blitzkrieg had run out of its own engine oil. For Colonel Peiper, the realization came long before Berlin fell. During his retreat, one of his officers asked what would happen to the Reich now that the offensive had failed. Peiper reportedly paused before replying, "It doesn't matter. We no longer have the means to fight another." That quiet admission, made in the Belgian woods amid frozen corpses and dead tanks, carried the final truth of the war's technological illusion: that no amount of courage or ideology could move a tank without fuel. As 1945 began, the shattered remnants of Peiper's regiment were pulled back to Germany. Many of his men would die in the coming months defending bridges, towns, and forests that no longer mattered. Their tanks remained motionless, serving as gun platforms in defensive lines that only delayed the inevitable. The war that had begun with lightning had ended in exhaustion. Yet, amid the ashes of defeat, the lessons of that winter would echo through military thought for decades. The failure of the Ardennes Offensive was not just a tactical blunder. It was a study in how industrial capacity defines strategy, how technology without logistics becomes theater, and how even the most advanced war weapons become forgotten relics when the fuel runs dry. And still, one final question lingered, one that historians would continue to ask long after the guns fell silent. How did a nation so advanced in engineering fail so completely in sustaining what it built? When the snow melted in the Ardennes and the wrecks of Peiper's tanks emerged from the thaw, the full magnitude of Germany's final failure could finally be measured. The frozen corpses, the silent engines, and the blackened fuel barrels told a story that no propaganda could rewrite. The German war machine, the same force that once rolled across Europe with terrifying precision, had suffocated on its own ambition. What had begun as an operational gamble ended as an industrial reckoning. By early 1945, Allied commanders studying the captured vehicles in Belgium reached the same conclusion. Germany had designed extraordinary machines, but built them on a collapsing foundation. A Tiger II's 700 horsepower Maybach engine, for instance, consumed fuel at nearly 3 times the rate of an American Sherman. The more advanced the tank, the shorter its operational range. The very innovation meant to ensure victory had become a liability when the Reich's synthetic fuel plants fell silent. Inside Germany, the consequences of that shortage were visible everywhere. Civilians queued for hours for scraps of coal. Military trains stopped mid-journey, their engines dry. Even aircraft production lines slowed because lubrication oil had run out. By March 1945, the Luftwaffe was flying fewer than 200 sorties per day, most of them one-way missions. Peiper's failed thrust through the Ardennes had been the last time German armor moved in any meaningful offensive formation. After that, movement itself became impossible. For Allied analysts, the lessons were immediate. In their post-action reports, officers noted that fuel, more than firepower, dictated the tempo of operations.
The U.S. Army's logistical doctrine, built on mass supply, pipeline networks, and truck convoys, had proven as decisive as any weapon. Those same convoys, protected by door gunners and machine guns like the M60 and later the M240, became the arteries of victory. Every mile of advance depended on those vehicles, their drivers, and the unbroken line of refueling points stretching back to Normandy. By contrast, German logistics in 1944 resembled a desperate improvisation. Without oil, the Reich turned to coal-to-liquid conversion and ersatz gasoline, but the process required immense energy and chemicals that were themselves running out. When Allied bombers targeted the hydrogenation plants at Luna, Bolin, and Scholven, they didn't just hit factories. They struck the heart of Germany's mobility. The Luftwaffe could no longer defend them, and repair crews could no longer rebuild them. Peiper's defeat thus became more than a battlefield episode. It became a case study in the collapse of industrial warfare. Even the Allies, flush with victory, recognized how close their own system had come to overstretch. General Omar Bradley later admitted that if the German offensive had lasted another 2 weeks, Allied forward units might have run short of fuel themselves. But the difference lay in resilience, the Allied ability to replenish and adapt faster than the enemy could destroy. Historians today often debate Peiper's personal responsibility, separating his military competence from the atrocities linked to his unit. But beyond those moral questions, the episode stands as a technical and logistical parable. It shows how the myth of mechanized superiority, the belief that speed and steel alone could win wars, ultimately collapsed under the weight of arithmetic. A Tiger II without fuel was no more powerful than a tractor. In the ruins of the Reich, post-war analysts from both sides compiled exhaustive studies of the Ardennes campaign. The U.S. Army's Historical Division Report No. 67 concluded that Germany's final offensive demonstrated the terminal weakness of an army divorced from industrial sustenance. German officers interviewed after the war admitted that by late 1944, every major operation was conceived under the illusion that captured resources could compensate for domestic shortages. Operation Wacht am Rhein was the last and most fatal of those illusions. When Colonel Peiper surrendered in May 1945, he was a ghost of the officer who had once led armored spearheads across Europe. His war was over, but its lesson was indelible. The engines that had defined his generation, the roar of panzers, the rhythm of MG-42s, the promise of lightning victory, had fallen silent. What remained was the understanding that strategy, however brilliant, cannot escape physics or supply. The ruins of Le Glaise still stand today as a museum. Among its exhibits are the rusted hull of a Tiger II, a half-track with its wheels frozen in mud, and a cluster of American fuel drums once captured by Peiper's men. Visitors often remark on their ordinariness, simple metal barrels, dented and blackened. Yet those barrels decided the fate of the Ardennes more than any tank or gun. They are reminders that in the machinery of war, power is never merely about fire, it is about endurance. Standing before those relics, one can trace the trajectory of a nation that mistook velocity for victory. Germany's engineers had mastered the art of destruction, but not the economics of continuation. The same brilliance that produced the MG-42 and Panther could not compensate for the absence of fuel, rubber, or time. It was a contradiction that burned itself out in the winter of 1944, when a colonel realized, amid barrels of stolen gasoline, that the Reich's power had already expired. That realization, preserved in military archives and veteran testimonies, remains one of the most profound in modern warfare. That the strength of an army lies not in the noise of its engines, but in the quiet discipline of its supply lines. Every generation since, from Korea to Vietnam, from the Gulf War to today's conflicts, has faced that same truth. Even the most sophisticated war weapons, from machine guns to gun truck convoys, are only as strong as the fuel that moves them. And so, when we look back at the smoldering roads of the Ardennes, we see not only the defeat of an army, but the unveiling of a principle that still governs every modern battlefield. Technology can win battles, but logistics decides wars.